Old Testament models for leadership. In this video, we're going to be exploring the biblical patterns of church leadership, beginning with the Old Testament prototype of leadership. Moses is the prototype of all spiritual leaders who follow. The spiritual leaders who are covered in Genesis, Noah, Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, were also leaders of God's people. However, their stories do not deal with the leadership aspect of their lives, but with their obedience to God. We are not privy to the struggles that they had to pastor the people. It is not until we come to Exodus that we see the example of a leader of God's people fully engaged in pastoral leadership. It is Moses' life that first reveals to us the struggles, features, conflicts, and triumphs of spiritual leadership. One question which has puzzled people throughout the ages is whether leaders make circumstances or whether circumstances make leaders. In Moses' case, it is obvious that God made Moses a leader. He prepared him from before he was born to take over the role of leadership. There is no one else prepared to take the place of deliverer but Moses. The unique situation that pointed to Moses as called is as follows. First of all, God's hand was upon Moses before he was born. His family was unique. He came from a family of priests among the people of Israel. His protection as a child from Pharaoh's genocide was a unique protection. His adoption into Pharaoh's household gave him a unique knowledge of writing and government. His failures gave Moses a sensitivity to God's leadership. His time in the desert gave Moses an appreciation for God's provision in hard times. His revelation at the burning bush gave him a unique appreciation for God's power. Now, Moses' calling was not just unique to him, but was also confirmed by others. Even so, Moses was not ready to take on the task of God's people until he was 80 years old. Before he could take on the leadership role of his people, God required that he be broken, inadequate, fully trained, and that it was exactly the right time in his life. In order to be a God's people, we must first learn to follow God. God continued to affirm Moses' calling in front of the people by giving him command and prophecies to be fulfilled. In the story of Exodus, Moses is not the shepherd of Israel. God is. In the conflicts with Pharaoh and the journey across the desert, Moses received commands from God and relayed them to his people. Moses was the mouthpiece of God. He did nothing of his own initiative, but he waited until God gave him direction. Moses was there not to be the absolute dictator of Israel, but only because he was taking dictation from God. God calls us to lead, but he may revoke that calling at any time. God's leadership under Joshua and Judges was different from that of Moses. What changed after Moses and during Joshua's time was this. First of all, that during the 40 years of the desert, God revealed himself in a way that is unparalleled in the entire Old Testament. God was supernaturally visible at all times in the pillar of fire, the cloud, the rock that followed them, and the mannas that nourished him. God spoke directly to the people at Sinai and indirectly through Moses. In the Exodus, there was two ways that God spoke. Through his Spirit, through Moses and Aaron, given daily directions, and through his word that was written. God therefore gave him both immediacy and stability. God showed them his unchanging nature, while the Spirit led him to change through daily circumstances. At the death of Moses, the nature of God's revelation and the position of God's leader began to change. Joshua took command of God's people. At first, Joshua's position was very much like Moses, with God giving him direct commands and performing miracles. Later, however, the pillar of fire, the cloud, and the manna ended, as well as the direct intervention in battles. God still occasionally produced miracles, but they were more infrequent. God's people were also encouraged to use their own ingenuity and strength. God became more of an advisor and less of a player in the affairs of Israel. Now, after Joshua's death, some more things changed during the Judges period. After Joshua, the leadership passed to tribal leaders. These elders were supposed to have studied the teachings and followed the path of God as Moses gave them in the Pentateuch. Unfortunately, they did not. Instead, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. God's people wandered from the truth and from God's advice. To answer this disobedience, God raised up judges. They are temporary leaders to answer the challenge of leading God's people. These judges were not infallible, nor were they always particularly righteous. They were simply God-anointed men and women who were used by him to lead and correct his flock. There are 4 leader roles in ancient Israel that follow after the judges: the prophet, the priest, the king, the scribe. The prophets were raised up by God as a movement in Israel. As Moses spoke for God in his days, the prophets spoke for God in theirs. These prophets were of various kinds from many walks of life. All of them spoke for God and directed God's people in their time. The kings, if the elders of Israel had taken seriously the commands of God through Moses, they would not have needed kings. They did not, however, take it seriously. Instead, the tribes fought between each other, and it became obvious that they needed somebody to keep them in line. This was not enough for them to have a judge who inspired. They needed a king to bring order and discipline. Saul was the first such leader. After he was rejected, David became king. David was also the first true king. He reigned for 40 years and was followed by Solomon, who also reigned for 40 years. These kings had absolute power, but they did not claim direct divine inspiration for everything they did. After Solomon, the nation was split into 2 countries. There were more kings, some good and some wicked. God's people kept the covenant sporadically and had an unstable existence in the land. The priests, in addition to the prophets, God continued the line of the priests. They kept the days and the rituals of the law. They brought daily comfort to his people by bringing their sacramental reminders of his fellowship with them. The scribes, or rabbis, in the later days of Judah, during the time of the exile, a new kind of spiritual leader gained authority. This was the scribe or the rabbi. He was not a prophet, since he told the people nothing new. Instead, he taught people the law of God so they could obey it. In a sense, he was the complementary opposite of the prophet, since he gave the law to help them interpret the Spirit. The scribes were a modification of the priestly function. They kept order of the law, and they led the people back to the stability of the past. The modern pastor is not a king, judge, prophet, priest, nor a rabbi. He's a combination of all of them. At times, he speaks the Spirit of God to his people. Other times, he humbly brings the Word of God. At times, he leads in discipline. At other times, he brings comforting rituals to them to help them in everyday life. To be a pastor, one must have thorough knowledge of the Word of God, a prayerful contact with the Spirit of God, as well as wisdom and experience. Without God's intervention in our lives, being a pastor is an impossible task. But with God's presence, it is a joy and a privilege. There's a model for pastoral ministry that is given to us in Psalm 23. Psalm 23 makes one thing clear. We are not the shepherd of God's people. The Lord is. We are at best under-shepherds, people who take orders from the true shepherd and assist him in performing his duties. These duties include making sure God's people have what they need to survive. I shall not want. Leading them to spiritual health and prosperity. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me by the still waters. Bringing healing to them. He restores my soul. He keeps me on the righteous path. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. When they stray from the safe path, correcting and defending him, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He keeps them safe from spiritual enemies. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. He creates a joyful, safe atmosphere among them. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. You point them to God's house. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever.